Hello, I'm Jesse Hirsh, and I'm here with my good friend Allan Gregg for another episode of the Red-Tory podcast. Now at the start of what could be the Great American Depression, notwithstanding any changes in policy, it seems that the fallout from the quote-unquote Liberation Day has been anything but liberation. Lots of stories to keep track of, lots of things to watch. So, as always, Allan, what do you got your eyes on? What do you want to start with today?
Well, it's clear that Donald Trump was listening to our podcast on Monday, because we told him he had an opportunity, a very short window, to cut and run and declare victory, and he's done that. He's gloating today, overwhelmingly, that everyone is getting ready to kiss his ass, in quotes, to get a better deal, and he's pulled back. Markets are up $3 trillion. So it's hard to say that's predictable, because nothing's predictable.
Yeah.
But in fact, I was kind of surprised at the extent of hysteria with the market crash, because I mean, we've never had one like that, where such an exogenous variable, such a controllable exogenous variable, was fully responsible, and knowing that it could be fully reversed in exactly the same kind of fashion. Now, this is still down, but it's up again $3 trillion today as well. So there you go. Welcome to Trump land.
Well, and I think part of the fluctuations in my reading over the last couple of days is not everyone pays as close attention as us. And I think a lot of people have been treating a lot of his pronouncements, a lot of his media musings as just words. And they were a little shocked that he followed through. I think there's a lot of people who are waking up to the idea that politics matters, that policy matters. And the volatility that I think we've been seeing, especially as Canadians, is really now sinking in for the rest of the world who thought this was just lip service. But I'm curious where the rollback has happened. I'm assuming not with China, because it does seem as if
still on there.
Yeah, that he likes that all these other countries are calling him up. He likes that all these other countries are saying, "Look, whatever you need, let's talk." Versus China remains belligerent. And belligerent in a way that is really impacting a lot of U.S. companies in terms of their supply chain, in terms of their larger costs. I'm curious what your thoughts are there, and whether that's one area that is going to be a kind of albatross around his neck.
Yeah, well, let me get to China in just a second. I think the thing that added to the financial markets chaos is that you had entering to the debate not his usual opponents or detractors, who make fun of him as a lunatic and low IQ and all this other stuff. You had very credible economists, a lot of Wall Street, very credible people, some of whom had been very supportive of him. And the basic argument was, you just got this wrong. Your goals might be, in fact, a lot of them went out of their way to say, the goals are supportable. The means are nuts.
Yes.
And the derision around the means. Erin Burnett the other night on CNN, I know you don't watch traditional news, but she had an economist who wrote the article on how you should calculate the reciprocal tariffs. And she had a whiteboard out, and she was able to do the math. And show it was ridiculous. But the China thing is real. I mean, you talked about this, I think, in the past, that part of this agenda that he doesn't articulate that much about is the tripolar world. And he really does see China especially as a direct threat to American hegemony and security and all these other things. And while he sometimes plays lip service to how much he likes Xi, that threat, I think he thinks is very real. And I mean, he does have a lot of people on his side, not only on the threat, but the fact that these guys don't play by the rules. Yeah. Their theft of intellectual property, their financing through sovereign wealth agencies that are non-competitive with other people who have to get in the real capital markets, and also just their massive domestic power, and how almost unstoppable China is as a consequence of that domestic power. So, yeah, this isn't over. It isn't far from over. I think the markets have breathed a sigh of relief, because they're just saying, well, he's not as intractable as he was saying on the golf course on the weekend.
Hmm. And to your point about China, I think they've also envied the currency control that China is
Yeah,
able to play, and we've speculated that part of this might be a desire to kind of engineer a cheaper U.S. dollar, making
yeah,
it easier for U.S. companies and U.S. manufacturers. I also feel that the larger subtext here, beyond to your point, everyone's saying, look, your intentions are right, but the way you're going about it is just ass backwards. Is more attention has gone on. I'm going to mangle his last name, Peter Navarro,
Navarro.
who
Yeah,
Navarro, yes, as people have been trying to say, well, who is ultimately the intellectual influence here? The origin story, and Rachel Maddow has really gone to lengths to try to reconstruct this. The origin story goes back to 2016 when he was first running for office, didn't have any foreign policy advisors, didn't really care about foreign policy, and he said to Jared Kushner, go find me someone smart, and they came up with Navarro.
hmm.
And part of it was his China stance because, he is very much a China hawk, and he was saying,
Yeah,
look, China's eating us alive. And there is, to your point, a lot of substance to that. I mean, China has literally been eating the US economy for the last couple of decades, and America is now finally waking up to how dependent the American economy is on Chinese manufacturing. But the other side is the plagiarism that he did in his book, that he
yeah.
created an expert that was just
It
him.
was him. Him.
Yeah.
Well, in that regard, him and Trump have got lots in common because Trump used to impersonate himself as a
Yes.
source and a leaker for the tabloids in New York City. Yeah, he clearly is an odd duck. I mean, how many White House advisors end up going to prison for being so kind of intractable and incorrigible in their dealings with Congress? And he actually went to a Florida prison and hung around there for four months. So, and the fact that now that Elon Musk is going after them, and the response from the White House, which is almost laughter. I mean, the press secretary said, "Boys will be boys."
Yeah.
Like two idiots. They're
Although
treating them.
that almost led me to believe that maybe Elon, the loyalist that he is playing a role, that he knows that he is kind of hated. He knows that he is the pariah, and better to have him articulating this kind of criticism that then allows Trump to be like, look at this debate that we're having. Look at how these great minds are coming together. We're really debating this. This is democracy. When, to your point, everyone's making fun of the policy,
Yeah.
right? So he kind of needs a way to allow there to be some plausible deniability, for there to be some debate.
Except, we talk, you especially talk, about the silence of the Magnificent Seven and how much they have at stake. At this, in fact, there's a remarkable picture of all of them at the inauguration, and above their head was a bubble about how much each of their companies had lost, and collectively between the five of them that were there, it was just a little under $3 trillion,
Yeah.
which is more than the GDP of everything that the top 10 countries in the world. But Musk, as all these other guys, have to be globalists because their supply chain is global. So we like to make fun of him as well as Trump, but he actually may be speaking from the heart here as someone who knows that you cannot interrupt these global supply chains in a drop of the hat and feel that there's impunity. The implications are massive.
Well, and one of the metrics we mentioned last time that I'm watching closely is Apple. And,
Yeah.
and in particular, iPhone production. One of the announcements that they just made, which is a stopgap measure, is in anticipating this, they've shifted a lot of production to India, and they've been producing a lot of iPhones in India. Ostensibly, this was for sale in the Indian market, but they are now redirecting the entire manufacturing run that they've done in India back to the United States,
Yeah.
so that it won't be subject to the tariffs that are coming from they make most of the stuff in Vietnam and in China, and still the vast majority of it in China. So part of it will be to see whether Apple can continue to reconfigure their supply chain so that they're not caught by all this. But also, there's a lot of speculation that Apple and the other big tech companies will just absorb this cost. That if they were to pass it on to consumers, that would be both politically and economically a bad move for them. But then the larger question is, how long can they do that?
Yeah, of
Right?
course.
How flexible, how resilient, and that to me is kind of where the rubber hits the road, because there are no more advanced manufacturer than Apple when it comes to an American company, and the extent to which they can respond or not to these policies, I think is quite significant.
Yeah, and those companies are not as kind of captive to their shareholder base as a lot of the other major financial service or manufacturing, because they're controlled so much from the top. Whether their instincts are to do that or not, I don't know. But again, the Canadian TSX was up 6 points, but Nasdaq was up 12
Yeah.
today. So
And the other interesting part of this in terms of where investors are trying to move their money is Microsoft has ironically fared comparatively well against many of the others in the tech sector. And I think it's a misreading. One of the reasons that a lot of investors are putting their money into Microsoft is they think that the cloud computing stuff is free from tariffs.
right.
That because cloud computing is not a product that travels across borders, that makes it more insular. But I'm hearing more and more about what is being called a European tech stack, which is basically a replacement of the American cloud, of finding and creating European companies that European governments and European corporations can use instead of Microsoft, instead of Amazon. So there's all these little landmines, as it were, that could still be as the world starts reconfiguring based on a distrust of America, because that is the lasting effect here, as we talked about last time, is reputational.
And then you talk about you have to add on that the regulatory threat to the multinational technology companies, which I think one of the reasons why they were as quiet as they were is that they'd like to see Europe's ass kicked right now too, because that's the epicenter of a lot of that regulatory pressure. And Europe has shown no qualms whatsoever by bringing these guys to court, bringing billion-dollar fines for monopolistic activity and behavior. And
it's not going to get any better.
You wouldn't
right?
think.
And the paradox is they're certainly not going to get access to the Chinese market. Right.
No.
So yeah, on the one hand, they're further getting locked out of China. On the other, they're antagonizing Europe as a marketplace. India, ironically, still remains a fairly favorable spot. And I recently learned that the two e-commerce giants in India, one is owned by Amazon, the other is owned by Walmart. So, it still remains a very reliable digital services market for the U.S. But I think we are seeing a turn when it comes to the trust. And another metric will be whether Canadians still start to subscribe to Microsoft, still use these services on a business level, or whether they will start finding Canadian alternatives, because they do exist. They're small and obscure,
Yeah.
but there are options there when it comes to choice in the market.
And we've seen in the whole tech ecosystem how companies can come from obscurity to, if not dominance, predominance in a very, very short period of time, and how conversely they can just disappear as well with one surprising. I remember going on the golf course with you, and as at the time I had my BlackBerry. And you said, the iPhone is going to surpass the BlackBerry. And it was like, you knucklehead. And because it's software.
Yeah.
And these other guys think it's hardware. And the point that you've also made too is that software doesn't rely on a supply chain in the same kind of way. You just switch a button, and it's wherever you want it to be. So that kind of transferability gives the existing firms tremendous fleet of footness, but it also opens the door for new arrivals should things turn on them.
Although, interesting kind of tangent there, Shopify, which is a big Canadian-esque company. They're not fully Canadian in the sense that they're they have been trying to move to America before all this started.
Yeah.
But they've reduced their workforce dramatically in the last 2 years. And part of it, there was a story today about how much they're relying upon AI to do so. But the fine print in all that was, while they acknowledge that they've kept their labor costs low, their AI labor costs remain through the roof because of the premium on AI developers.
Yeah.
And it kind of also shows this other subtext, which brings back Elon Musk and the H-1B visa program, that AI talent is so expensive, so scarce, that this could be another trouble spot for America, that if they continue to alienate the literal immigrants, right, who can command these salaries, if they can find that money in Europe, if they can find that money in Japan, in Canada, that would be a huge competitive disadvantage to these American firms.
Except you obviously missed another news story today, because Donald Trump has solved that problem too, because he's going to generate all the electricity needed for AI with coal.
Yes. This is Eric Schmidt testifying in Congress. I don't know if that's related.
With guys behind him in coal miners' hats. I mean, you really do. I know I hate these people who treat, Trump like he's a clown. Because I mean, there's all kinds of things to laugh at, but you have to take a guy seriously who has the power.
Yes.
That he does. But you just shake your head and you say, why would you bother with that issue?
Yeah. Yeah.
The ability to bring back coal production it's like, again, relocating an auto plant in a week. It's just, it cannot happen. 96% of all new generational products are renewable right now.
Yes. Yes. And renewable. Look, it's nostalgia. And I think the coal miners' nostalgia, and Appalachia in particular, runs very deep. I suspect there are still some coal mining companies in the United States who use new methods, right? The taking the entire mountaintop off method, that certainly feel empowered. But you're right to point out that yesterday and today, Congress has had a hearing on energy needs. And Eric Schmidt, former chair of Google, who is a titan unto himself, like he is, I believe, a billionaire due to all his investments. He testified basically trying to project the energy needs for AI moving forward. And they're obscene, absolutely obscene. The amount of gigawatts that the U.S. will require to do this. It's nuclear, it's coal, it's magic believe energy. Like I don't know, to your point, like where are they going to make all this stuff?
Double proportionally. Well, when you've got Microsoft looking to buy 3 Mile Island, you just go, the world has gone insane. It truly has.
Yes. And
it really has. I mean, rekindled, pardon the pun, the whole nuclear industry, which now is considered, I mean, some of the better stocks on the market for the last 2 years are ones that have a nuclear component to a renewable basket of generating capabilities. And so that is completely, say, rekindled and made, Germany, for example, with their decision to get rid of nuclear power plants, look like a fool.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and definitely be in a difficult position because the dispute with China very much centers around critical earth minerals. And I say critical because it includes rare earth minerals and the stuff you need around manufacturing and energy production, especially when it comes to batteries, especially when it comes to solar tech. So it makes sense that America would look to nuclear as that kind of quote unquote green future. But AI, regardless of whether artificial intelligence is substantive or not, it is a perfect focal point for national security because it combines energy, it combines computation, it combines critical minerals, it combines all these elements that these economies and these militaries will need to operate. So it becomes a really interesting rallying point for them to say we do need to double our electrical infrastructure, or we do need to double generative power capacity.
And do you get the sense that the Magnificent Seven are all into AI? They are all betting the farm on AI?
Everyone but Apple. Apple right now is being criticized because they haven't bet the farm on AI, and it may actually. I mean, look, Apple has their own issues throughout their entire operations, but yes, the industry believes that they are in a competitive race, an arms race, and if someone else wins before they do, all of their revenue is gone, all of their
Right.
services are gone. I don't feel it's as high stakes, but again, the residuals of competing is talent. Because what there on the one hand, there's the hardware, which is Nvidia, right? This is why Nvidia stock continues to go up, and the announcements that have come out in the last week that challenge Nvidia are every major one of these big seven are now in the chip business. Right? Meta's now making chips. Amazon's now making chips. Google's now making chips. So on the one hand, this is why NVIDIA is starting to waver and people are saying maybe it's not the juggernaut that it is. But the other is talent, software, right? And they need to secure all the AI engineers that they can. That's why there's this premium. And the bigger the project, the more godlike the project, the more that they motivate these researchers, the more that they can retain these researchers. So yes, they are true believers, but I think it doesn't matter to them if they achieve it. It's the process of trying to achieve it that allows them to continue to pursue their business mainstays.
Another question for you, because given again one of the many initiatives that we're hearing in Canada about maintaining more self-sufficiency, more internal sovereignty, is the recruitment of talent. I mean, does that very fact and the isolationism of America give Canada a unique opportunity to recruit that kind of talent that AI needs at this particular point in time, do you think?
Yes, but and the yes is I'd say for us it's less recruiting, more retaining, because we've been recruiting these people. They just pass through Kitchener Waterloo on their way to Silicon Valley, right? And the question is, how do we get them to stay? How do we get them to go to Canada?
Sorry, why is that? Is because we're not good at scaling up our businesses. There's nothing here to stay to, or
Yes, but no. I would say the scaling up, we don't even get there. It's investment capital in the first place.
okay.
Our investment capital, surprise, surprise, is risk averse. So it's really not interested in the angel round or the first two rounds of startups, and those are crucial. That's where Silicon Valley, as wealthy as it is happy to invest in those early round fundraising. Canadian companies, it's everyone has said over and over and over, we have a conservative investment climate that's due right down to the venture capitalists, but also to the pension plans, right? Also to the larger institutional funds. So on the one hand, it's attracting. On the other hand, we need a kind of ecosystem. And this is where, to bring us back to the red part of Red-Tory, I would love to see more public funding. I would love to see more public investing, not so much in private enterprise, but in the seeds of private enterprise. Because most of the talent that comes here, they don't actually want investors. Like, they don't want to dilute their idea early. What they want is the capital to actually develop that stuff. So imagine a scenario where University of Toronto, University of Waterloo, McGill, a consortium of universities had public money to invest, right? So it was, again,
and add, as you mentioned, the pension funds, which are under tremendous pressure to do more domestic investing.
But I'm saying not even there. Let them be the second tier, right? I mean the high risk stuff. Let's allow universities with public funds to deal in high risk entrepreneurship that has a high rate of failure, because universities, quite frankly, don't care if they fail. And that way you're empowering the actual creators themselves before, because the other side to this world is once the venture capitalists come in, they want their return. Right? So they're going to put pressure towards monetization. They're going to put pressure towards getting it versus the Googles of the world, the Amazons of the world. They had a long runway to experiment. That's what we need. We need a university style, public funded entrepreneurial ecosystem where the creators, the inventors had more autonomy to think outside the box. Then you have the pension plans. Then you have the venture capitalists come in and pick the winners. Right? Come in and pick the ones who have already had the idea. The problem now is they're gatekeeping the entrance. So they don't allow any free radicals. They don't allow any
Wow.
unorthodox people to even get in the early stage.
Right.
And that's where Silicon Valley is way better at that.
I think in Canada, there's an additional complicating factor with the universities that they can never figure out who owns the IP.
Yes.
You know, they try to attract these people and they say that, oh, the IP will be yours. And then they say, well, no, and they just can't figure that part of the equation out, it seems. Anyway.
Yes. Versus me being the very Red-Tory, I would say have the government hold on to that IP, have a situation in which the entrepreneur gets maybe 20% of that IP, but it goes back into a sovereign fund, right? A country fund, because that allows us to roll it over, right? As soon as you have your first hit, all of a sudden you've got more funds to start doing more startups. Because we don't need another Nortel. We don't need another BlackBerry. We need 100 of them, right? We need a matrix of different companies who are engaging the global marketplace in a diversified manner. And I really don't think Canadian capital, private capital, is going to do that. You need some form of public capital to seed that, because the talent's there, the idea's there, the potentially commercializable ideas are there. There isn't the support structure really to make that happen. Now,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'd say they just haven't figured out. It's not like the government doesn't give business, you know,
Tons.
a massive amount of subsidies and taxpayers' dollars,
Yes.
to which they do nothing other than kind of buy back their own shares.
Yeah. And my criticism of this, very selfishly, is it's gatekeeping. That they are only allowing the safest, most normal, most conformist people, when we need the weirdos, right? We need the real, and the classic example of this is Vitalik Buterin, the creator of Ethereum, who is this global celebrity guy that most people don't know of, but you know, one of the pioneers of blockchain, one of the titans of the crypto world, did all of this in the GTA with almost zero institutional support. And he's still sort of in Canada, but this is an example where Canada should be claiming Ethereum as one of our own, but we don't, because it was done outside of institutions. Because Vitalik is the kind of weirdo who would never make it through, you know, the filters of all this. But before we move on from all this stuff, I want to come back to TikTok, because TikTok has had some news in the last couple of days. There's been a few consortiums who have worked with the U.S. government, who have worked with ByteDance to have a deal. They were really close to having the deal done. Trump approved it. ByteDance approved it. But then the Chinese government said, no fucking way.
Yeah.
And even though they've extended it another 45 days, I wonder if TikTok is going to be the fly in Trump's ointment, because the reason that he came to its defense was, I think he has the instinct that this is popular, that the kids love it, that there's a huge kind of cottage industry of TikTokers in America.
Oh, yeah.
And he wants a deal, and I think China knows how bad he wants the deal, and they are willing to let TikTok go dark in America just to screw Trump. And this is another story that I think we should be keeping our eyes on.
I'll watch for it, because I know very, very little right now. I mean, I knew about the extension.
Yeah.
And I know enough also that it, you know, that, and you use it all the time, is that the popularity is remarkable, both in terms of, as you say, creating these quite, you know, thriving young entrepreneurs who are actually making a living as TikTok influencers. And, you know, the young kids, if they want to say, how do you bake an angel food cake? You know, rather than going to Google and ask that, or chatbot, you know, GPT, they go to TikTok and see a video of someone making an angel food cake. So there's a whole kind of usage there that, you know, my generation doesn't fully understand, but is clearly a big, big part of youth culture today.
Well, and that China has arbitrary power over this is something that I think the administration is underestimating.
Yeah.
Now, I want to pivot to Canada, but I want to do so using a personal anecdote that you posted on your Substack, talking about the 1980 federal election.
Oh, yes.
And you shared an insight that I thought was really quite profound in terms of the role that polls play in election campaigns. They're almost oversized, corrupt role because of the way that journalists use it as a very blunt instrument to create what I feel are really blunt narratives. But why don't you briefly share that anecdote and use it as a way to extrapolate to the present?
Well, I mean, the conventional wisdom was back when it started to become a controversy is that the polls were bad because they influenced the voter. Someone would see how people were going to vote and they would change their vote accordingly. That actually happened in 2015, but that's the only election I can ever think of where you actually saw that kind of strategic voting by virtue of, in this instance, the Liberals looked like they were significantly more likely than the NDP as revealed through polling to beat Stephen Harper, and you saw a tremendous gravitation of NDP voters over to Liberals. But with that exception, I mean, voters aren't influenced at all by who's winning and who's losing. But this was the 1980 election where there was virtually no polling. I think there probably maybe 3 polls over the course of an entire writ period of 40 some days, up to 48 days. Whereas today you're seeing up to 7 a day being publicly released. And one of the polls that had come out very early on had the Tories, who I was working for, 21 points behind the Liberals. This is led by Trudeau, who had got whomped in 79. And it was devastating because first the morale for the party, but also it changed the way the media was covering the news because the lead was so large, there was no need to cover the actual campaign anymore, the events in the campaign. And so they started to conjecture, how did the Tories get into this much trouble in the past? You know, what would have happened if they would have done this and that, conjecturing and all the other things? Or as they got closer to the Ritz, what is the new Liberal government going to look like? The election itself was a foregone conclusion. So
Yeah.
very things that could have caused voters to change their opinion, that is, events that were occurring in the campaign, were not covered by journalists. And the conclusion clearly is that while the polls didn't influence voters very much, they influenced journalists very much because they changed what the journalists considered news and what they didn't consider news. And when we had Bill Fox on the show, he talked about that, how there was a time when the journalists, what the news was whoever was the focus of the news. And that was if you had a 2-minute spot, they were there for 1 minute and 50 seconds. And as time went by, they actually disappeared from the reporting, and the reporter would say what the source of the news said or did or what have you. So it was quite a revelation for me as a young guy. I think I was 28 years old at the time, you know, immersed in polling when it was a very early discipline of kind of saying, okay, no, this is how polls do influence the larger socio-political culture, not in a way that conventional wisdom had us to believe.
And there seems to be a kind of determinism to it, that to your point, on the one hand, you could almost indict the journalists for not understanding the dynamics ahead of time, right? Like they react to polls the way a dog reacts to a squirrel. But to your point, almost take it as an accurate view of the future when it's not.
No,
absolutely. Right? There's so many variables at play, and it's almost like they, in their reductionist view, eliminate all of that and focus on this one tiny metric.
Well, we've talked about this off camera. That's in no small measure because there's kind of an unholy alliance between the pollsters and the media. The media get this stuff for free. They don't pay for anything. So it is absolutely the cheapest source of news that they have available. So they love it. The pollster, in turn, doesn't get any money for it because they're doing it in exchange for their profile and their reputation. But by the same token, almost all of these polling firms are little mom and pop shops with no moms.
Yeah.
They're little small businesses. They can't afford to eat a whole bunch of overhead. So all as they're giving the media is one question. If an election was held tomorrow, whose political candidate would you vote for? So there's none of the kind of in-depth analysis that the political parties are doing that let them understand, you know, how volatile is the electorate? How likely is it that votes could shift between now and election day? Who are the cohorts that are most likely to shift? What are the issues that are most likely to motivate them to shift? All of those things that really do give you a robust understanding of what the public mood and public sentiment is vacant when it comes to the news. All as you're getting, as I say, is these 7 polls saying if an election was held tomorrow, the horse race questions. These are the results. And often they lead more to confusion than they do to any kind of comprehension of what's going on.
Well, and further, they lead to a much more insular narrative amongst journalists and the political class because they're referring to this imagined model that they're following, while everyone else is depending on their commitment level, just, getting pieces of the political coverage.
And I'll give you one example of that that's happening right now, because, with the advent of Carney coming on the scene, with the U.S. threat to Canada's economy and sovereignty, we've talked about this, is that the whole kind of criteria upon which people are using to make their political judgments has shifted and changed to Pierre Poilievre's detriment.
Yeah.
And so his news coverage, I mean, it's quite classic. I mean, you look, I know you're not a traditional news media, but I read the Globe and Mail every day. Political story. First column and a half is Mark Carney. Next 4 paragraphs are Poilievre. And then the last paragraph is Jagmeet Singh. That's they're kind of proportional their coverage to where they are in the polls. And it's only in the last couple of days that journalists are starting to cover the extent of these rallies that Pierre Poilievre is holding. And they are massive. He was in Toronto, in Edmonton the other day, and granted he had Stephen Harper there too. 20,000 people.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't get that at political rallies. Trust me, even close. And it suggests that there's something going on there. And even if it's only the something that's going on is that the base is really motivated, that's something in its own right that is a dynamic that can make a huge amount of difference in terms of both not just voter turnout, but voter persuasion.
Yeah.
If you're so on Mark Carney and I'm crazy on Pierre Poilievre, I mean, I'm going to make, Marshall, a much more vigorous argument with you about why I'm right and you're wrong than you are, vice versa. So, but that's just a current example of how they've kind of missed this news story until it was so overwhelmingly obvious they couldn't ignore it anymore.
And it becomes the dog chasing the squirrel because there is no continuity.
No.
Right? From the audience perspective, you're like, well, where did all these rallies come from? Right? And you start to disbelieve it because it doesn't fit where the narrative was coming from before. No. And similarly, I like yourself, am the kind of person where we don't know what's going to happen until election day. And even then, right, there's a lot of variables. But if we were to assume that, as expected, Carney wins and wins a majority government, there's going to be a lot of Tories who are going, wait a minute, I was at that rally. Why was that rally not reflected either in the results or in the coverage? And that's when you get the language of stop the steal. Yeah. Right? That's when you get the language of this is not a legitimate government.
Fake news, the lamestream news. Yeah.
Yeah. And that creates future conflict. That creates future tension when instead there should be more of a genuine attempt to cover what people are experiencing, which in these cases are those rallies. Yeah. Although every time I see coverage of Poilievre, I keep thinking of your line of, would you want to have a beer with this guy? And, I saw a really fascinating post of most Canadian women say no.
Oh, for sure.
But there is something to be said about the anger that he is expressing and that he is mobilizing, because there is legitimately a lot of anger out there. And, Carney is playing a completely different campaign. And it strikes me that both Carney's running against Trump, Poilievre is running against Trudeau, and that's still working on some level. It's probably not going to be enough to get him elected. But to your point, a lot of people are showing up because they don't want the Liberals to win. They don't like the current economic situation.
Oh, and that's the other thing that's so unusual about this this election campaign is that you really have, dueling mindsets going on here. I mean, there is a constituency that isn't concerned about a relatively abstract issue like tariffs, who are still focused very, very much on historical grievances of what's happened in the last couple of years and affordability today, and are looking for a disruptor. And those people are overwhelmingly voting conservative.
Yeah.
Those who are more focused on the uncertainty of the future and are looking for a stabilizer are disproportionately looking for Carney. But it's like two very distinct constituencies out there with very, very distinct mindsets, making very, very distinct political choices based on completely different criteria than the other cohort.
And how you, at some point, bring those two together to have a sane society is the missing variable.
After the fact. Well, again, to give him his credit, David Coletto at Abacus did a very, very good poll this week where he showed that while, the plurality of the electorate are looking for a stabilizer, and a significant minority are looking for a destabilizer. That you still got almost 30% are looking for someone who has both. And if the real challenge for Mark Carney is to show that he can offer stability and change at the same time, not stability and the status quo. That's his biggest threat right now.
Yeah. Although this is where a short campaign benefits him.
Oh, no question.
Because where you're right that Polyev is reaching his base, I suspect we may see a similar geographic divide, both regionally but also rural versus urban. And the question is, where do the suburbs fall? And whether enough suburbs can go blue to stop this red wave. And that while there's not a lot of time, a lot of things could happen. Here's a crazy question. Does the market stabilizing or Trump backing off this tariff insanity, does that benefit Polyev? Because then it becomes less of an issue of global chaos.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes is the shortest answer. Is it enough to get people to say, okay, that's not a problem at all now?
Yeah.
I doubt it, because the chaos just never seems to stop. I mean, we're into day 80 right now of Nutty Town. But in theory, you're absolutely right. I mean, Pierre Polyev is in the trouble he's in, not because he ate a rat on stage, is because the entire dynamic of political discourse shifted under him before he could wake up.
Yes.
And now he's having a very, very hard time pivoting. It's interesting now what he and Stephen Harper in the same kind of rally tried to do is now they're trying to go at Carney's credentials as a solid stabilizer, as a manager, knowing that there's a good chance they can't get away from the issues that are making those skill sets that much more salient and demanded by the electorate. They have to try to diminish them.
Well, and to go back to the role of the mainstream media, which Polyev is deliberately trying to keep at arm's length. Yeah. Are you seeing his stuff translate? Because we know he's getting through direct. We know that part of the reason I would argue for these rallies is the social media dynamic, that it's emotional, it's mobilizing, it gets people fired up. Is he making a mistake in not trying to also court voters via the mainstream media? Is his stuff translating from your perspective, given that you are, really watching the mainstream media and kind of how this stuff is being reported?
Well, we talked again when Fox was on the show. We talked about that. How it was probably a silly decision on Polyev's part, kind of a petulant decision.
Yeah, seems vain.
Yeah, it does, to keep the media. We don't need you. You're just legacy crap off the bus and the plane. And if he hasn't been receiving that kind of coverage, in many respects, he has no one but himself to blame, because he's relying disproportionately on regional broadcasters to cover him when he's in the regions. And we know two things about regional broadcasters. One, there's way fewer of them today than they ever had before. And two, by definition, they're regional.
Yes.
They're not national. So while the national feeds can plug in, he's shooting himself in the foot. There's no question.
Well, and he's also actively disrespecting them, which is why I wonder whether that is impacting their coverage.
But the other thing, too, is that this isn't new. I mean, he did this during the leadership campaign, too, which no one really saw coming until they saw it and were stunned. I mean, the fact of the matter is he is quite a brilliant political orator and has an ability to get a room really ginned up. In a way, it's even better than Justin Trudeau, who's a terrific retail politician. He was never a great public speaker. And it'll be very interesting, again, if that skill set comes to fore next week in the debates. Very interesting to see.
Yeah. Now, not to get ahead of ourselves, but in having this conversation, I can't help but feel that we are also on the verge of a national crisis of, whether it's the West feeling disgruntled with the center, whether conversely, if Polyev does pull it out and wins, there'll be issues in terms of urban voters. But it does feel that the anti-Trump unity maybe at least temporarily wearing thin as people start to assume or anticipate the next federal government. Am I overreading this, or do you
Oh,
think that there are some regional divisions that could be starting to find friction?
I think you're overreading it a little bit. I mean, that former Reform leader Preston Manning did a piece, an op-ed in the Globe and Mail, where he said that if Mark Carney's elected for the fourth term for Liberals, he's just inviting Western separatism. Angus Reid Institute responded by doing a poll, and it shows that Carney win does gin up the sentiment for separatism or joining the states or whatever else, but only about 1 in 3, where you still have 7 out of 10 Albertans and Saskatchewans saying the no. So
Hmm.
that's interesting, though. It's higher than Quebec right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
That's
in no small part because, Quebec is an export oriented economy,
well,
versus Alberta, it's fossil fuels, and there's differences in terms of how those are being impacted. And
Well, the other thing too that the Angus Reid Institute showed is that a lot of that sense of "fuck Canada," I'd rather go somewhere else, even though it's in the minority, is driven by a belief that the rest of Canada doesn't respect, whereas Quebecers believe the rest of Canada actually respect. So,
yeah, it's just a matter of of the issue as to whether they're going to get that respect moving forward, because everyone, quite frankly, seems to be doing a little bit of suspended disbelief that
yeah.
we've got this great enemy and we can all get along, and all those problems are still there. Any final thoughts moving forward? The Canadian election seems, as last time, pretty much set on tracks. I
Yeah.
was going to mention that Jagmeet Singh has been facing some difficult polling questions from people, especially now that his own seat seems quite likely for him to lose. It's ironically caused a lot of NDP voters I know who were going to vote Liberal, who are now thinking about voting for their local NDP candidate as a future leader because they're anticipating a complete vacuum at the top of the
Well,
NDP.
we touched on it, but at the time, I mean, I was flabbergasted in the Ontario election how strong those NDP incumbents were.
Yeah.
I mean, they trailed as a party 11 points behind the Liberals in popular vote and ended up winning twice as many seats.
Yeah.
I mean, you rarely ever see that. And it just says something about NDP incumbents that
Yes.
they do have a much stronger sense of engagement and relationship with their constituents than a lot of other members of parliament or members of legislative assemblies who tend to be more or less invisible, especially in the urban centers.
Well, and not to get too off topic, but I think part of it is the connection to social movements. That
Yeah.
there are a lot of not independent, individual NDP politicians who are very tied to pro-Palestinian, very tied to pro-working class. A lot of the protest movements that are there,
Environment
yeah,
as well. Yeah.
100%, and their authority, their credibility comes from a different source, and I think that is why so many NDP voters are upset with the leadership alienating these social movements, because they see it as a lost opportunity, and that's where it will be interesting, the extent to which, because the NDP is going to be decimated, the extent to which they are decimated, and who remains, and whether that'll be enough to create a new party, or, to our larger conversation, whether they become the left part of the Liberals, right,
Yeah.
or the radical side of the Liberals, in the classic kind of Red-Tory, but in the Liberal sense of. Again, I think that the nature of this election is anything can happen, and it'll be curious to see how that plays out. The same way, one last thought, and I think I mentioned this previously, so we don't have to get into it. If the Tories get decimated, could we be seeing a reform comeback? Could we be seeing like a social credit comeback? Could we be seeing the right start to fragment into its various factions? How difficult will it be for them to stay united if there's a liberal majority government that can just proceed ahead as the big red machine often does?
Well, you got to know that if they lose for the fourth time in a row, having been leading by 25 points, there will be recrimination, no
Yes.
question,
Yeah.
and a lot of finger pointing. So
Yeah.
we'll wait for that.
It'll be fascinating to watch. And to your point, I think this is why the debates will be perhaps the most important in a long time in Canadian history. Steve Paikin taking his usual job as Mr. Moderator. We'll see how that plays out. Any final thoughts before we conclude?
I'm on the road a little bit at the end of this week, so I'm going to miss Friday, but we'll be back next week.
Right on. And I suspect a lot will happen between now and Monday, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you see it. So Red-Tory, we're available on YouTube, on the audio podcast. I will say that we have had a boost on the audio platform podcast side. I think it was due to your appearance with our good friend Pam Wallen, partly because our comments have started skewing a little bit more towards the right. But thank you, everyone who listens to the episode. Please rate us on your favorite podcast platform, like us on YouTube, and we love your comments. The Morris Strong conspiracy is one that we sort of chuckled at because it goes back to the old days.
Whatever.
But thanks again, everyone. Glad you could listen. We hope to talk to you soon.
Take care all.